Elizabeth Morgan stepped down from the train at Silverfall Station, her modest carpetbag clutched tightly in one hand, the other gripping the slender white cane that swept methodically before her. The June sun warmed her face as the locomotive that had carried her nearly 2,000 miles westward chugged away, leaving her in a strange town where not a single soul knew her name. The faint scent of pine and dust tickled her nose, while unfamiliar sounds swirled around her boots on wooden planks, distant hammering, horses nickering, and voices she couldn't place. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Miss? You waiting on someone? A gruff voice startled Elizabeth from her momentary stillness. She turned toward the sound, her unseeing eyes hidden behind tinted spectacles that shielded them from painful brightness. Yes, she replied, summoning the composure that had carried her through 26 years of navigating a world of darkness. Sheriff James Callahan. He's expecting me. A beat of silence followed, then a low whistle. You're the mail order. Bride from Boston? The one the sheriff's been waiting on. Elizabeth nodded, her chin lifting slightly. I am Elizabeth Morgan. Yes, well, I'll be... The station attendant's voice trailed off, and Elizabeth could feel the weight of his unspoken assessment. She was accustomed to it, the moment when people realized she was blind, when their expectations shifted and reshaped around this single fact of her existence. Sheriff's tied up with some trouble out at the Henderson place, the man continued finally. Said if you arrived before he could get back, I should see you settled at Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house. Elizabeth swallowed her disappointment. James Callahan, the man who'd exchanged letters with her for nearly 7 months, the man who'd promised to meet her and make her his wife, wasn't here. A flicker of doubt crept along her spine. Had she made another terrible mistake? I see, she said, the irony of her words not lost on her. And where might I find Mrs. Whitaker's establishment? Just down the main street, ma'am, but with your condition. Perhaps I ought to. My cane and I will manage quite well. Thank you, Elizabeth interrupted with practiced politeness. Simply point me in the right direction and provide any obstacles I should be aware of. The attendant cleared his throat. Straight ahead about 200 yards. Whitaker's has a little gate and 3 steps up to the porch. Can't miss the smell of her apple pies. Best in the territory. Thank you, Elizabeth said, adjusting her grip on her carpetbag. The rest of my trunks? I'll have them sent over directly. With a nod of thanks, Elizabeth extended her cane and began the careful journey into Silverfall, a frontier mining town in the Montana Territory that was to be her new home. Each step was measured, deliberate, as she counted in her head and listened for the sounds that would orient her in this new landscape. Silverfall was nothing like the crowded streets of Boston. The boardwalk beneath her feet creaked with each step, the spaces between buildings allowing gusts of wind to buffet her modest gray traveling dress. The sounds of saloon piano, distant hammering from what must be a blacksmith, and the occasional whinny of horses created an auditory map that Elizabeth began to construct in her mind. She had always possessed an exceptional memory and keen sense of hearing gifts that had served her well since the fever took her sight at the age of 8. These abilities had allowed her to work as a skilled piano tuner in Boston, one of the few respectable professions open to a blind woman. But even that hadn't been enough to secure her future after her aunt's passing left her without family or means of support. Sheriff James Callahan's advertisement in newspaper, read to her by her landlady's daughter, had seemed like providence. Law officer in Montana Territory seeking woman of good character, education, and gentle disposition to be his wife. Their correspondence had given her hope, his letters speaking of respect, partnership, and the promise of a new beginning in the majestic mountains of the West. Not once had he mentioned physical beauty as a requirement, which had given Elizabeth the courage to respond honestly about her blindness. He had replied that her unique perspective intrigued him rather than dissuaded him, and that he himself had seen enough of the world's darkness to appreciate someone who navigated it with grace. The cryptic comment had puzzled her, but his continued interest had eventually persuaded her to accept his proposal. She had been forthright about her condition, her background as a piano tuner, and her desire for a fresh start. What she hadn't anticipated was arriving to find him absent. The scent of baking apples suddenly wafted through the air, and Elizabeth slowed her pace. This must be Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house. Her cane detected the gate the station attendant had mentioned, and she carefully navigated through it, counting 3 steps up to what must be the porch. Before she could locate the door, it swung open, releasing a stronger wave of the apple fragrance. "Well, you must be Miss Morgan," came a warm, melodious voice. "The sheriff sent word you'd be arriving today. I'm Abigail Whittaker. Welcome to Silverfall." "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, relieved at the genuine welcome in the woman's tone. "I understand Sheriff Callahan was called away on urgent business." "Those Henderson boys are always stirring up trouble," Mrs. Whittaker confirmed. Come in, come in. You must be exhausted after such a journey." The interior of the boarding house enveloped Elizabeth in warmth and the mingled sense of baking, furniture polish, and fresh laundry. Mrs. Whittaker gently took her elbow, guiding her through what seemed to be a front parlor. "The sheriff mentioned you were blind in his note," Mrs. Whittaker said matter-of-factly. "My late sister lost her sight to cataracts in her final years, so I'm somewhat familiar with how to be of assistance without being intrusive. Please don't hesitate to tell me what works best for you." The straightforward acknowledgement, delivered without pity or discomfort, eased some of Elizabeth's tension. "I appreciate that very much, Mrs. Whittaker. Now, your room is on the ground floor. I thought that would be most convenient. It's small but comfortable, with a window that catches the morning light and a door that opens onto the side garden. The sheriff has arranged for your board until the wedding, which I understand is to be in 2 weeks' time." Elizabeth's heart quickened at the mention of the wedding. It was really happening. This new life she had gambled everything on was taking shape, even in the sheriff's absence. Mrs. Whittaker showed her to the room, patiently describing the layout as they moved through the space. Bed against the left wall, washstand to the right of the door, wardrobe opposite the foot of the bed, small writing desk beneath the window. "Thank you," Elizabeth said, setting her carpetbag on what felt like a patchwork quilt covering the bed. "This is most kind." "Dinner's at 6, Mrs. Whittaker informed her. "There are 2 other boarders, Mr. Peterson, our schoolteacher, and Dr. Miller, who's new to town himself. I'm sure you'll find them pleasant company. Rest now, and I'll call you when the meal is ready." Left alone, Elizabeth removed her bonnet and gloves, then carefully explored her new surroundings with her fingertips, committing each detail to memory. The smooth oak of the bed frame, the porcelain pitcher and basin on the washstand, the crisp linen curtains that fluttered in the fiery breeze from the open window. This room would be her sanctuary until she married Sheriff Callahan and moved to what would become their home. The thought brought both anticipation and anxiety. What kind of man was James Callahan, really? His letters had revealed an educated mind, a sense of justice, and a loneliness that had resonated with her own. But letters could conceal as much as they revealed. Would he be disappointed when they met face to face? Would the reality of her blindness prove more challenging than he had anticipated in theory? Elizabeth sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had done. She had traveled across the country to marry a man she had never met, in a town where she knew no one, with no way to return if things went awry. She had gambled everything on the words written in those letters. A knock at the front door of the boarding house pulled her from her thoughts. Heavy boots crossed the parlor floor, and a deep voice exchanged words with Mrs. Whittaker. Elizabeth rose, smoothing her travel-wrinkled dress, her heart racing. Had Sheriff Callahan returned? Another knock, this one on her bedroom door. "Miss Morgan?" Mrs. Whitaker called. "Sheriff Callahan is here to see you." Elizabeth took a deep breath. "Please, ask him to come in." The door opened, and the floorboards creaked under the weight of what must be a substantial man. The scent of leather, gunpowder, and pine filled the small room clean, masculine scents that Elizabeth found not unpleasant. "Miss Morgan." His voice was deep, resonant, exactly as she had imagined it when reading his letters. There was a slight hesitation before he continued. "I apologize for not being at the station to meet you. The Henderson situation required immediate attention." "I understand, Sheriff," Elizabeth replied, extending her hand in what she hoped was his direction. "Duty must come first in your position." A large, calloused hand enveloped hers, the grip firm but gentle. "James, please, at least when we're not in public." He paused, and Elizabeth sensed him studying her. "Your letters didn't mention how lovely you are." The compliment surprised her. Most men, upon learning of her blindness, treated her as if she were invisible. "Thank you," she said softly, "though I wouldn't know. It's been 18 years since I last saw my own reflection." "The fever that took your sight," he acknowledged. "You mentioned it in your third letter." So he had been paying attention. "Yes, I was 8 years old." Another pause, longer this time. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose we both navigate the world differently than most." The cryptic comment echoed the one from his letters. "What do you mean?" Sheriff Callahan cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitaker didn't tell you." "Tell me what?" "I lost my right eye in the war," he said simply. "Shrapnel from a Confederate shell. At Gettysburg. I've worn a patch ever since." Understanding dawned on Elizabeth. "That's what you meant in your letters about seeing the world's darkness." Yes, the word carried a wealth of meaning. Most people find it disconcerting. "Between that and the scar that runs from my forehead to my jaw, I'm not what most women would consider a handsome prospect." Elizabeth couldn't help but smile. "And I'm not what most men would consider an ideal wife." "Perhaps we're well matched after all, Sheriff." A deep chuckle rumbled from him. "Perhaps we are, Miss Morgan. Perhaps we are." In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of shared experience, of understanding what it meant to be judged for what was missing rather than valued for what remained. "Mrs. Whitaker mentioned the wedding is to be in 2 weeks," Elizabeth said. "Is that still your wish?" "If it's agreeable to you," he replied. "I thought it would give you time to settle in, to be sure this is what you want." The consideration in his words touched her. He wasn't rushing her, wasn't assuming her agreement was irrevocable now that she had arrived. "That seems wise," she agreed. "We should take the time to become acquainted in person, not just through letters." "Good," relief colored his tone. "I have duties to attend to this afternoon, but I'd be honored if you would join me for dinner tomorrow. There's a decent restaurant at the hotel that serves passable beefsteak. I'd like that very much." The sheriff moved toward the door, then paused. "Miss Morgan Elizabeth, I want you to know that if at any point you decide Silverfall isn't where you belong, or that I'm not the man you wish to marry, I'll arrange for your return to Boston. No questions asked, no recriminations." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The offer stunned her. In a time when women had few options and little recourse if a situation turned sour, his promise represented extraordinary freedom. "That's very generous, Sheriff." "James," he reminded her gently, "and it's not generosity, just decency. I'll call for you at 6 tomorrow evening." After he had gone, Elizabeth sat again on the edge of the bed, her mind whirling with impressions. James Callahan was not what she had expected, yet somehow exactly what his letters had suggested, direct, honorable, and carrying his own wounds that the world might see as flaws. For the first time since leaving Boston, Elizabeth felt the tight knot of anxiety in her chest begin to loosen. Whatever happened next, she sensed that James Callahan was a man of his word, one who would treat her with respect regardless of the outcome of their arrangement. The dinner bell rang, summoning her to meet the other boarders and face the inevitable curiosity her arrival had stirred in Silverfall. With practiced movements, Elizabeth checked her hair, straightened her spectacles, and reached for her cane. One step at a time, one day at a time, it was how she had always navigated her darkened world, and it would serve her well in this new chapter of her life. The boarding house dining room hummed with conversation when Elizabeth entered, by Mrs. Whittaker's gentle hand at her elbow. The conversations hushed momentarily as the other diners became aware of her presence. "Everyone," Mrs. Whittaker announced. "This is Miss Elizabeth Morgan, who arrived from Boston today. She'll be staying with us until her wedding to Sheriff Callahan." A scraping of chairs indicated the men had risen, as propriety dictated. "Miss Morgan, welcome to Silverfall," came a refined voice that Elizabeth immediately placed as belonging to an educated man. "I'm Thomas Peterson, the schoolteacher." "And I'm Dr. William Miller," added another voice, younger and with a hint of an Eastern accent. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance." "Gentlemen," Elizabeth acknowledged with a nod in their general direction. "I'm pleased to meet you both." Mrs. Whittaker guided her to a chair, discreetly helping her locate the utensils and describing the placement of dishes on the table. "Roast chicken at 12 o'clock, potatoes at 3, green beans at 6, and fresh bread at 9, she murmured, using the clock face system Elizabeth had mentioned earlier when explaining how she preferred to navigate meals. "Thank you," Elizabeth sighed, genuinely appreciative of the woman's thoughtfulness. "So, Miss Morgan," began Dr. Miller as dishes were passed, "what brings a Boston lady all the way to our little corner of Montana?" Elizabeth had anticipated the question and prepared a response that offered enough information to satisfy curiosity, without inviting pity. "I was a piano tuner in Boston, but when my aunt passed away last year, I found myself at something of a crossroads. Sheriff Callahan and I corresponded through a respectable matrimonial agency, and here I am." "A piano tuner!" exclaimed Mr. Peterson. "How fascinating. We have a piano at the schoolhouse donated by one of the mine owners, but I fear it's woefully out of tune. Perhaps you might lend your expertise." "I'd be happy to," Elizabeth replied, pleased that the conversation had immediately turned to her skills rather than her disability. "The children would be delighted," Mr. Peterson continued. "Music lessons are a rare treat in Silverfall." "Dr." Miller cleared his throat. "I understand you're blind from childhood, Miss Morgan. May I ask if it was congenital or acquired?" The directness of the question might have offended some, but Elizabeth appreciated his medical interest over morbid curiosity. "Acquired. Scarlet fever when I was 8 years old. The illness was severe, and while I recovered, my optic nerves were irreparably damaged. I've read some fascinating research from Vienna about such cases," Dr. Miller said. "Dr. Ludwig Muffner has been documenting various forms of optic atrophy and their causes." "I'm afraid Boston doctors were less academic about my condition," Elizabeth said with a small smile. "They simply declared it God's will and advised my parents to find me a suitable asylum." A shocked silence followed her matter-of-fact statement. "But they didn't," Mrs. Whittaker prompted gently. "No, my mother taught me to read Braille and insisted I receive the same education as any sighted child. When my parents died of influenza, my aunt continued their approach. She believed disability need not mean inability." "A wise woman," Mr. Peterson commented, "and clearly successful in her methods, given your accomplishments." The conversation shifted to local matters, the progress of the new church building, concerns about water rights for the outlying farms, and speculation about whether the railroad would eventually extend a spur line to Silverfall. Elizabeth listened attentively, building her understanding of the community that would become her home. After dinner, Mr. Peterson offered to play the guitar, and the small group retired to the parlor where Elizabeth found herself genuinely enjoying the simple entertainment and easy conversation. It was different from Boston's formal social gatherings, where she had often felt like an awkward curiosity, tolerated, but never truly welcomed. Later, as she prepared for bed in her new room, Elizabeth reflected on her first day in Silverfall. The journey had been long, the arrival not what she'd expected, but there was promise here, in Mrs. Whittaker's kindness, in the straightforward acceptance of the other boarders, and most significantly, in Sheriff James Callahan's unexpected offer of freedom. She thought of his voice, deep and resonant, and the gentle strength in his handshake. She thought of his missing eye, the war wound that had marked him as different in the eyes of society. Just as her blindness marked her, there was comfort in knowing he understood what it meant to be judged for what was missing rather than what remained. As she drifted toward sleep, Elizabeth realized that for the first time in years, she felt something like hope, not the desperate hope that had driven her to answer a stranger's advertisement, but a quieter, more grounded hope that perhaps she had found a place where she might truly belong. Morning arrived with the cheerful chorus of birdsong outside, Elizabeth's window, and the tantalizing aroma of coffee and bacon wafting under her door. She dressed carefully in one of her better dresses, a dark blue cotton with white piping that her aunt had always said brought out the blue of her unseeing eyes. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency through the familiar routine of arranging her hair in a simple but neat chignon and securing her tinted spectacles in place. The rest of the day passed in a blur of introductions and orientations. Mrs. Whittaker proved an excellent guide, helping Elizabeth learn the layout of the boarding house and its immediate surroundings. They walked the length of Silverfall's main street, with Mrs. Whittaker patiently describing each building and introducing Elizabeth to shopkeepers and townspeople they encountered. General store to your right, run by the Weber family. Post office and telegraph next door. Across the street is Hanson's apothecary, then the Ass's office, and the Silver Dollar Saloon. Best to hurry past that one during certain hours. Elizabeth absorbed it all, creating a mental map of her new home. The townspeople's reactions to her varied. Some were awkwardly formal, others warmly welcoming, and a few spoke loudly and slowly as if blindness affected her hearing as well as her sight. She weathered each interaction with the grace and patience long practice had taught her. By late afternoon, she was mentally exhausted but had accomplished much. She had arranged to tune the school's piano the following morning, accepted an invitation to Sunday services at the newly completed church, and even managed to locate a small lending library in the back of the general store where Mrs. Weber promised to find someone who could read to her occasionally. Back at the boarding house, Elizabeth rested before preparing for her dinner with Sheriff Callahan. She chose her finest dress for the occasion, a deep burgundy silk that had been one of her aunt's last gifts. The richness of the fabric beneath her fingertips reminded her of the woman who had raised her with such loving determination. "You will not hide away from the world, Elizabeth," Aunt Margaret had insisted. "Your blindness is a circumstance, not a definition of who you are." Those words had carried Elizabeth through countless moments of doubt and difficulty. They steadied her now as she heard the distinctive tread of Sheriff Callahan's boots on the boarding house porch. Mrs. Whittaker showed him into the parlor where Elizabeth waited, her cane resting against the settee beside her. "Sheriff Callahan." "To see you, Miss Morgan," Mrs. Whittaker announced, then discreetly withdrew. "Good evening, Miss Morgan." His deep voice filled the room. "You look lovely." "Thank you, Sheriff James," she corrected herself. "I hope burgundy is still considered fashionable. Boston styles may not have reached Montana yet." A soft chuckle. "I'm afraid I'm not the best judge of ladies' fashion, but I can appreciate beauty regardless of current trends." He offered his arm, and Elizabeth took it, noting the solid strength beneath her fingertips. As they walked toward the hotel restaurant, James described the evening sky, the storefronts they passed, and the people who greeted them providing the visual context she couldn't access without making her feel like a child being led. The hotel dining room was busier than Elizabeth had expected, the hum of conversations and clink of silverware creating an auditory tapestry around them. James guided her to their table, discreetly helping her locate her chair without making a show of assistance. "I've taken the liberty of ordering for both of us," he said once they were settled. "The beefsteak here is reliable, and Mrs. Chen, the cook, makes an excellent apple cobbler for dessert." "That sounds perfect," Elizabeth replied, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. Many people found dining with a blind person awkward, unsure how to navigate the practicalities without causing embarrassment. A brief silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but expectant. There was so much to learn about each other beyond what their letters had revealed. "Tell me about Silverfall," Elizabeth prompted. "How long have you been sheriff?" 5 years now," James replied. "I came west after the war, looking for, I suppose, a fresh start. Worked as a deputy in Helena for a while. Then when the position opened here, I took it." "And what is it like, being responsible for law and order in a mining town?" James considered the question, challenging sometimes. Mining towns attract all sorts honest men looking to make their fortune, swindlers looking to make it easier, and plenty in between. But Silverfall's settling down now. The initial silver rush has stabilized into proper mining operations. We have families, a school, churches. It's becoming a real community. "That's how it seemed today as I met people," Elizabeth agreed. "There's a permanence here that I didn't expect." "And what did you expect?" His tone was curious, not defensive. Elizabeth smiled slightly. "Truthfully, I wasn't sure. The novels I've read about the West paint rather dramatic pictures, constant danger, lawlessness, women perpetually in peril." James laughed, a warm, genuine sound that Elizabeth immediately liked. "I'm afraid the dime novelists would be disappointed by most of my days. Settling disputes over property lines and reminding cowboys that shooting isn't permitted within town limits isn't quite as exciting as stagecoach robberies and dramatic showdowns at high noon." "Thank goodness for that," Elizabeth said fervently. "I've had quite enough excitement simply getting here." Their food arrived, and James discreetly described the placement of items on her plate using the clock face method Mrs. Whitaker had employed. The simple consideration confirmed Elizabeth's growing impression that James Callahan was a man who paid attention to details and cared about others' comfort. As they ate, their conversation flowed more easily, moving from the practical aspects of life in Silverfall to their personal histories. James spoke of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his time at West Point, and the horror of the battlefields where he had lost not only his eye but many friends. "The physical wound healed," he said. Quietly, the others take longer. Elizabeth understood. She told him about the darkness that had descended during her illness, how she had raged against it at first, then gradually learned to adapt, to find new ways of experiencing the world. "My aunt used to say that what I lost in sight I gained in insight," she said. "I'm not sure that's true, but I did learn to listen more carefully, to perceive things others might miss." "Like what?" James asked, genuinely interested. "Like the fact that despite your calm exterior, you're somewhat nervous tonight," Elizabeth said with a small smile. "Your breathing changes slightly when you're deciding whether to ask a personal question, and you tap your finger against your leg when you're considering how to phrase something delicate." A moment of surprised silence, then another of those warm laughs. "Remind me never to play poker with you, Miss Morgan. You're entirely too observant, Elizabeth," she reminded him. "And observation is a skill like any other. Necessity taught me well." As the evening progressed, Elizabeth found herself increasingly comfortable in James Callahan's company. He was straightforward yet considerate, intelligent without being condescending, and possessed a dry wit that frequently made her laugh. Most importantly, he treated her blindness as a fact, not a tragedy or a burden. Over apple cobbler and coffee, James broached a subject they had both been circling. "I've been thinking about practical arrangements, should you decide to proceed with our marriage, such as," Elizabeth prompted. "My house is small but comfortable, 2 bedrooms, a parlor, kitchen, and study. It would need some adjustments to make it navigable for you. Consistent placement of furniture, clear pathways, that sort of thing." The matter-of-fact way he discussed these accommodations, without resentment or martyrdom, reassured Elizabeth. "I don't require elaborate changes," she assured him. "Just consistency and perhaps some tactile markers at crucial points." "I've also spoken to Mrs. Weber at the general store," James continued. "She's agreed to order any special supplies you might need from Helena or even San Francisco, if necessary." "That's very thoughtful," Elizabeth said, genuinely touched by his foresight. "Though I don't require much beyond what any household would have. My aunt ensured I could manage with standard tools and techniques. Nevertheless, the option is there." He paused, then added more hesitantly, "There's also the matter of my duties as sheriff. They can be unpredictable, sometimes dangerous. I may be called away at odd hours, occasionally for days at a time if there's trouble in the outlying areas." Elizabeth heard the unspoken question. "You're wondering if I can manage alone during those times?" "Yes," he admitted. "Not that. I doubt your capabilities, but it's a valid concern." "I managed a household with my aunt for many years," Elizabeth said. "I can cook, clean, mend, and handle most domestic tasks without assistance. The layout of a new home would present a challenge initially, but not an insurmountable one." "And the potential dangers of my position?" Elizabeth considered this carefully. "Every life has its risks, James. In Boston, I faced different but no less real dangers: unscrupulous landlords, economic uncertainty, the vulnerability that comes with being a woman alone. At least here, I would have a community and a husband who sees me as a person, not just a disability." Something in her words seemed to resonate deeply with him. When he spoke again, his voice carried an emotion Elizabeth couldn't quite identify. "Elizabeth, I want you to know that whatever you decide about our arrangement, meeting you has been illuminating. I'm beginning to think we might suit each other rather well." The simple statement, devoid of flowery sentiment or excessive promises, touched Elizabeth more than elaborate declarations might have. "I'm beginning to think the same," she admitted. As James escorted her back to the boarding house under a sky he described as filled with more stars than a city girl has ever imagined, Elizabeth reflected on the evening. There was an ease between them, a mutual understanding that went beyond their shared experience of navigating the world with physical differences. James Callahan was not a perfect man, she sensed a reserve in him. Wounds not yet fully healed, but he was honest, honorable, and treated her with a respect few had offered. At the boarding house door, James took her hand. "I have rounds to make early tomorrow, but perhaps you would join me for a proper tour of the town in the afternoon. There are places Mrs. Whittaker might not have shown you." "I'd like that," Elizabeth agreed. "I'm tuning the school piano in the morning, but I should be finished by noon." "Until tomorrow, then." He raised her hand to his lips in a gesture that belonged to a more genteel world than the frontier town of Silverfall. The unexpected courtliness made Elizabeth smile. "Good night, Sheriff," she said softly. "Thank you for a lovely evening." Inside, Elizabeth found Mrs. Whittaker waiting up, ostensibly mending but clearly curious about how the dinner had gone. The older woman's genuine interest and lack of prying questions made it easy for Elizabeth to share her positive impressions of James. "He's a good man," Mrs. Whittaker affirmed. "This town was lucky to get him as sheriff, and some woman will be lucky to have him as a husband." "Do you think that woman could be me?" Elizabeth asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. Mrs. Whittaker was silent for A moment, considering. "I think," she said finally, "that sometimes Providence works in unexpected ways. Who would have thought a Boston piano tuner and a one-eyed sheriff from Montana would find each other? Yet here you are, and it seems to me you both have qualities the other might value highly." The simple wisdom in those words stayed with Elizabeth as she prepared for bed. Her journey to Silverfall had been a desperate gamble, driven by necessity more than romantic notions. Yet somehow, in this remote mountain town, she had found something she hadn't dared hope for: the beginning of understanding, of respect, perhaps even of belonging. As she drifted towards sleep, Elizabeth realized that for the first time since leaving Boston, the knot of anxiety in her chest had fully unraveled, replaced by a cautious but growing optimism about what tomorrow might bring. The morning sun painted golden patterns across the schoolhouse floor as Elizabeth's fingers danced over the piano keys, her sensitive touch detecting the subtle imperfections in tone and tension. The instrument was indeed woefully out of tune, just as Mr. Peterson had warned, but it had good bones, a respectable upright that simply needed attention after its journey west and subsequent neglect. "That's remarkable," Mr. Peterson commented from nearby, where he was arranging primers for the day's lessons. "I've been wincing at those sour notes for months." Elizabeth smiled as she worked the tuning hammer. Pianos are living things in a way. The wood breathes with the seasons, and the strings respond to humidity and temperature. This one just needs a bit of coaxing back to harmony. She continued her methodical work, finding peace in the familiar task. Each string brought into proper tension was like restoring order to a small corner of the universe, something Elizabeth had desperately needed after the upheaval of her journey. Her mind drifted to the previous evening with James, to the surprising ease she'd found in his company. "Miss Morgan?" Mr. Peterson's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "The children are beginning to arrive. Would you mind terribly if they observed your work? It would be educational for them." "Not at all," Elizabeth replied. "I'd be happy to explain the process if they're interested." Soon the schoolroom filled with the sounds of children arriving, excited chatter, the scuffing of boots on the wooden floor, the thump of books being placed on desks. Elizabeth continued her work, aware of curious eyes watching her fingers. "Children, this is Miss Morgan," Mr. Peterson introduced. "She's graciously repairing our piano this morning." "How can she fix it if she can't see it?" came a young boy's blunt question, followed by a hushed, "Hush, Tommy, that's rude," from another child. Elizabeth turned toward the voices with a gentle smile. "That's a fair question, Tommy. I don't need to see the piano because I can hear and feel what's wrong with it. Would you like me to show you how it works?" A chorus of enthusiastic agreement followed. Elizabeth spent the next hour not only completing the tuning but demonstrating to the fascinated children how the piano's mechanisms functioned, letting them feel the vibrations of strings and explaining how the hammer and key system translated touch into sound. "It's like magic," whispered a small girl who had crept close enough for Elizabeth to feel her presence at her elbow. "No, it's science and mathematics," Elizabeth corrected gently, "which are even more wonderful than magic because they're real. And you can understand them." "Just like you can understand the world without seeing it?" the girl asked. "Exactly," Elizabeth agreed, touched by the child's perception. "We all have different ways of understanding the world around us." As the morning lesson began, Elizabeth finished her work, closing the piano with a satisfaction that went beyond the instrument's now sweet tones. She had connected with these children, offering them a glimpse of how different abilities could lead to different, but equally valid perspectives. "The piano sounds wonderful, Miss Morgan," Mr. Peterson said as he walked her to the door. "The children were captivated by your demonstration. I wonder might you consider offering music lessons while you're in Silverfall? Even one afternoon. A week would be a tremendous opportunity for them." The request surprised Elizabeth. She had never considered teaching, having focused her career on the technical aspects of piano maintenance rather than performance. Yet the children's eager questions and rapt attention had awakened something in her, desire to share her knowledge that she hadn't recognized before. "I would need to discuss it with Sheriff Callahan," she said thoughtfully. "But yes, I think I might enjoy that very much." The prospect of having a purpose beyond being James Callahan's wife, of contributing to the community in a meaningful way, filled Elizabeth with unexpected joy as she made her way back to the boarding house. She had come to Silverfall seeking security and companionship, but perhaps she had found something more, a place where her skills were valued, where her difference was accepted as simply another way of being in the world. As promised, James arrived at the boarding house just after noon. "I hear you worked miracles on the school piano," he said by way of greeting, his deep voice warm with approval. "Word travels fast in Silverfall. Hardly miracles," Elizabeth demurred. "Just basic maintenance that should have been done ages ago. Mr. Peterson asked if I might consider teaching music lessons once a week." "And what did you tell him?" James asked as he offered his arm to guide her down the porch steps. "That I would need to discuss it with you, since we'll be married soon and my time would no longer be entirely my own." James made a thoughtful sound. "Elizabeth, I want to be clear about something. While I hope our marriage will be a partnership, in every sense, I have no desire to dictate how you spend your time or use your talents. If teaching music would bring you satisfaction, I'd be the last person to stand in your way." The declaration, delivered in his straightforward manner, warmed Elizabeth's heart. So many men would have insisted their wives devote themselves solely to household duties. James's understanding of her need for purpose beyond marriage suggested a depth of character that continued to impress her. "Thank you," she said simply. "I think I would enjoy sharing music with the children." "Then it's settled," James replied. "Now, I promised you a proper tour of Silverfall. There's more to the town than just the main street Mrs. Whitaker showed you." Over the next several hours, James guided Elizabeth through a detailed exploration of Silverfall, describing everything from the architectural details of buildings to the mountain vistas visible from various vantage points. Unlike many sighted people who grew uncomfortable with such descriptions, assuming they were wasted on a blind person, James seemed to understand that words could paint pictures that transcended physical sight. "We're at the edge of town now," he explained as the boardwalk gave way to a dirt path. "There's a creek about 20 yards ahead, Silver Creek, which gave the town its name. The water's clear enough to see the bottom, with smooth stones that shine like silver in the sunlight. Aspens line the banks, their leaves making that distinctive rustling sound when the breeze catches them." As if on cue, Elizabeth heard the gentle whisper of leaves and the burbling of water over stones. "It sounds peaceful," she observed. "It is. I come here sometimes when the weight of the badge gets heavy." He guided her to what felt like a bench overlooking the creek. "I thought we might sit for a while if you'd like." Elizabeth settled beside him, aware of his solid presence and the careful space he maintained between them. Close enough for conversation, not so close as to presume intimacy. "Tell me about the weight of the badge," she prompted gently. "What makes it heavy?" James was quiet for a moment, and Elizabeth sensed him weighing his words. "Making decisions that affect people's lives," he finally said. "Upholding the law while still trying to show mercy where it's deserved. Knowing when to step in and when to let people settle their own disputes. It sounds like a delicate balance." "It is." He shifted slightly on the bench. "Before the war, before this," she heard him tap what must be his eye patch, "I saw the world in simpler terms. Right and wrong, black and white. Now I see more shades of gray." "Is that why you came west after the war?" Elizabeth asked. "To find a place where those gray areas might be more accepted?" "Partly," James acknowledged. "And partly to escape the pity. In the East, people couldn't see past the eye patch and the scar. Every conversation began and ended with my injury, as if it had erased everything else about me." Elizabeth understood all too well. As if your entire identity had been reduced to a single fact about your body. Exactly. The relief in his voice was palpable, the relief of being truly understood. But here, people see the badge first. The man second, and the missing eye barely registers after the initial meeting. I'm judged by what I do, not by what I've lost. That's what I'm hoping to find here as well, Elizabeth admitted. In Boston, I was always poor blind Miss Morgan first, and Elizabeth a distant second, if at all. And what would you like? To be in Silverfall? James asked, his tone suggesting the question mattered deeply to him. Elizabeth considered this. Just Elizabeth, I suppose. A woman who happens to be blind, rather than a blind woman who happens to be everything else. I think you'll find that here, James said softly. Frontier towns have a way of valuing people for their contributions rather than their conditions. Can you shoot straight? Can you work hard? Can you be trusted to keep your word? Those are the questions that matter. And can you tune a piano? And teach music? Elizabeth added with a smile. Exactly. She heard the answering smile in his voice. Silverfall may be rough around the edges compared to Boston, but there's a simplicity to life here that strips away pretense. They sat in companionable silence for a time, listening to the creak and the distant sounds of the town going about its business. Elizabeth found herself more at ease with James Callahan than she had been with anyone since her aunt's passing. There was something solid about him, reliable in a way that went beyond his position as sheriff. He spoke what he meant and meant what he spoke, a quality rarer than it should be. James, she said finally, may I ask you something personal? Of course. In your letters you mentioned wanting a wife, but you never explained why. Why now, after all these years alone? And why seek a bride from the East rather than finding someone locally? The question had been on her mind since their first meeting. While their correspondence had revealed much about their characters and backgrounds, the fundamental motivation for his advertisement had remained somewhat vague. James took a deep breath. That's fair to ask. The simple answer is loneliness, I suppose. I've built a life here, a good life in many ways, but an empty house at the end of the day starts to wear on a man's soul. And the more complex answer? Elizabeth prompted, sensing there was more. I turned 40 last winter, he continued after a pause. Found myself taking stock, as men do at such milestones. I realized I'd spent so many years focused on surviving first the war, then establishing myself here that I'd forgotten about living, about sharing life with someone. But why not court one of the local women? Surely there must be eligible ladies in Silverfall or nearby towns. James chuckled, though the sound held little humor. The eligible ladies, as you call them, made it clear early on that a one-eyed sheriff with war nightmares wasn't what they had in mind for a husband. The few who showed interest seemed more attracted to the position than the man. The honesty of his admission touched Elizabeth deeply. So you decided to seek someone who might understand what it means to be judged for physical differences. I didn't specifically seek someone with a disability, if that's what you're thinking, James clarified. But when your letter mentioned your blindness so forthrightly, without shame or self-pity, something resonated. The way you described adapting, finding different ways to accomplish what needed doing, it spoke of a character I could respect. And the war nightmares? Elizabeth asked softly. You mentioned those just now. She heard him exhale slowly. Yes, they come less frequently now, but they do come. It seemed only fair you should know before making your decision. Elizabeth nodded, appreciating his candor. My aunt used to say that scars, visible or invisible, are simply proof we've survived something that tried to break us. Your aunt sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. Elizabeth smiled at the memory. Stubborn as the day is long, but wise. A comfortable silence fell between them again, broken only by the natural sounds of the creek and distant birdsong. Elizabeth found herself wondering what James looked like, not just the eye patch he'd mentioned, but his overall appearance. In Boston, she would never have asked, as it would have been considered improper. But here in this frontier town where convention seemed less rigid, perhaps it was acceptable. "James," she said hesitantly, "would you mind describing yourself to me? I know about the eye patch, of course, but I'd like to have a complete picture, if you don't mind." "Not at all," he replied, though she detected a note of self-consciousness in his voice. "I'm tall 6 feet and an inch or so, broad-shouldered from years of physical work, dark hair with more gray than I'd like to admit, especially at the temples. The eye patch covers my right eye, and there's a scar that runs from about mid-forehead down to my jaw on that side." "And your remaining eye?" Elizabeth prompted. "What color is it? Blue, or so I'm told. My mother used to say they were the color of the sky on a clear winter day." Elizabeth nodded, piecing together these details with the voice she'd come to know and the solid presence she felt beside her. "Thank you, that helps me see you better. May I ask you something similar?" James ventured. "I know you mentioned losing your sight at 8 years old. Do you remember what things looked like?" "Some things," Elizabeth confirmed. "Colors, general shapes, the faces of my parents and aunt. But the memories have faded over the years, become less distinct. I remember the concept of blue more than the actual experience of seeing it, if that makes sense." "It does," James said. "Like how I remember having 2 eyes, but the actual experience of binocular vision has become abstract." With time, the shared understanding passed between them like a current. Elizabeth felt James shift on the bench, turning toward her more directly. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "we've known each other in person for barely a day, though our letters gave us a foundation. I meant what I said about giving you time to be sure this is what you want. But I find myself—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I find myself already certain that I would be honored to have you as my wife." The directness of his declaration made Elizabeth's heart skip. There was no flowery sentiment, no excessive promises, just an honest statement of feeling that aligned perfectly with what she was beginning to feel herself. "James," she replied carefully, "I came to Silverfall out of necessity as much as choice. I won't pretend otherwise. But in these brief hours together, I've found myself thinking that what began as practicality might become something much more meaningful." She felt his hand move closer to hers on the bench between them, not quite touching, but an invitation nonetheless. Elizabeth closed the distance, allowing her fingers to rest lightly on his. "Then perhaps," he said, "we proceed as planned, but with the understanding that we're building something based on mutual respect and growing affection, rather than mere convenience." "I would like that very much," Elizabeth agreed, the warmth of his hand beneath hers feeling like a promise more binding than any written contract. As they walked back toward town, James's arm once again offered as steady support. Elizabeth felt a sense of rightness settle over her. She had gambled everything on this journey west, on the character of a man she knew only through letters. That gamble, it seemed, might pay dividends far richer than mere security. The remainder of the week passed in a pleasant routine that gave Elizabeth increasing confidence in her decision. Each day brought new discoveries about Silverfall and its inhabitants, new depths to her conversations with James, and new possibilities for her future life. She began offering piano lessons to a small group of eager students, finding unexpected joy in sharing her knowledge of music. The children's curiosity about her blindness was refreshingly direct, without the awkward pity adults often displayed. "How do you know which keys to press if you can't see them?" asked little Sarah Miller, the doctor's daughter. "The same way you learn to find your way around your bedroom in the dark," Elizabeth explained. "Practice and memory. My fingers know where each key is without my eyes having to see them." She demonstrated by playing a complex piece from memory, her fingers flying over the keys with confident precision. The children's delighted applause warmed her heart in a way professional accolades never had. James, true to his word, gave her space to settle into Silverfall while still courting her with a quiet attentiveness that grew more meaningful with each passing day. They dined together each evening, sometimes at the hotel restaurant, sometimes at small gatherings hosted by town families eager to welcome the sheriff's intended bride. Through it all, Elizabeth's initial impression of James only strengthened. He was indeed a man of integrity, compassion, and unexpected depth. His reputation in Silverfall spoke volumes. From the respect shown by hardened miners to the easy way children greeted him on the street, it was clear James Callahan was both admired and genuinely liked by those he served. More telling were the small, private moments between them. The way he described the sunset in terms of warmth and texture as well as color, knowing she would appreciate such details. The patience with which he helped her learn the layout of his house during her first visit there. The genuine interest he showed in her opinions on everything from literature to local politics. By the end of the week, as they sat together on the boarding house porch after dinner, Elizabeth had made her decision. "James," she said, turning toward the sound of his breathing beside her, "I don't think we need to wait the full 2 weeks before the wedding." She heard the creak of the porch swing as he shifted to face her. "Are you certain? I don't want you to feel rushed." "I'm certain," Elizabeth confirmed. "I came to Silverfall seeking a partner in life, and I found him. Unless you have reservations?" "None whatsoever," came his immediate response, the certainty in his voice matching her own. "I would marry you tomorrow if the preacher were available." Elizabeth smiled. "Perhaps not quite that soon. We should give Mrs. Whitaker and the town ladies time to prepare a proper celebration. Sunday after next was the original plan. Let's keep to that." 8 more days then, James said, and she heard the smile in his voice. "I can be patient for 8 more days." He reached for her hand, his touch now familiar and welcome. As his fingers intertwined with hers, Elizabeth marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From desperate uncertainty in Boston, to growing confidence in Silverfall, from pragmatic acceptance of an arrangement, to genuine anticipation of a marriage. The blind piano tuner and the one-eyed sheriff, an unlikely pair by any standard. Yet in their shared experience of navigating a world designed for those unlike themselves, they had found a connection deeper than most. In their respective losses, they had discovered a mutual understanding that needed no explanation, no justification. As the evening stars emerged above Silverfall, invisible to Elizabeth's eyes, but vividly described by James's words, she felt a sense of homecoming that transcended physical sight. She had traveled west seeking security and found so much more. Purpose, respect, community, and the beginnings of love with a man who saw her completely, blindness and all. The early morning sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across Elizabeth's wedding dress as Mrs. Whitaker made final adjustments to the simple yet elegant gown. 8 days had passed more quickly than Elizabeth could have imagined, filled with preparations, piano lessons, and evening walks with James that had only deepened her certainty about the path she had chosen. "Hold still, dear," Mrs. Whitaker instructed, securing a final pin. "There. Perfect. The cream silk suits you beautifully." "Thank you for everything," Elizabeth said, reaching out to squeeze the older woman's hand. "Not just the dress, but for welcoming me so warmly when I arrived." "Nonsense," Mrs. Whitaker replied, though Elizabeth could hear the pleasure in her voice. "Having you here has been a joy. Though I'll miss your company when you move to the sheriff's house today." "It's hardly across the territory," Elizabeth teased. "Just 3 streets away." "True enough." Mrs. Whitaker adjusted the lace collar at Elizabeth's throat. "Now let me describe how you look so you can truly appreciate my handiwork." Elizabeth smiled, touched by the thoughtfulness. While she had long ago accepted that her appearance was something she could only experience through others' descriptions, today she found herself genuinely curious about how she would appear to James as his bride. The dress falls in a line from the fitted bodice, with delicate lace trim at the collar and cuffs. We've secured your mother's cameo brooch at your throat, and the pearl combs hold your hair in a soft upswept style, with a few curls framing your face. The cream color brings out the blue of your eyes and complements your fair skin. Mrs. Whitaker paused. You look every inch the beautiful bride, Elizabeth. The sheriff won't know what hit him. A knock at the door interrupted them. It's time. Ladies, came Mr. Peterson's voice. The church is filled to capacity, and the groom is looking equal parts nervous and impatient. Elizabeth took a deep breath, sudden butterflies fluttering in her stomach. This was happening. She was about to marry a man she had known for just over a week, in a town thousands of miles from everything familiar. Yet despite the apparent recklessness of it, Elizabeth had never felt more certain of any decision in her life. Mr. Peterson had offered to escort her down the aisle, a kindness Elizabeth had gratefully accepted. He now took her arm with gentle formality. Ready to become Mrs. Callahan? He asked as they descended the boarding house stairs. More than ready, Elizabeth replied with conviction. The short walk to the church passed in a blur of well-wishes from townspeople who had lined the route. Silverfall had embraced the sheriff's wedding as a community celebration, with businesses closed for the morning and everyone turned out in their Sunday best. At the church doors, Elizabeth paused, orienting herself to the space she had visited only once before. The scent of pine boughs and flowers filled the air, along with the subtle notes of beeswax candles and polished wood. The murmur of conversation hushed as she entered on Mr. Peterson's arm, replaced by the first notes of a wedding march played on the newly tuned piano by one of her young students. Mr. Peterson guided her down the aisle with measured steps, quietly describing the scene. The church is decorated with wildflowers and pine branches. Everyone from town is here, watching you with smiles. And James is waiting at the altar, standing tall in his best suit, with the sunlight from the eastern window catching on his sheriff's badge. Elizabeth could feel the attention focused on her, but for once, it didn't make her uncomfortable. This wasn't the pitying gaze she had so often felt in Boston, but rather the warm regard of a community witnessing a joyful occasion. When they reached the altar, Mr. Peterson placed her hand in James's waiting grasp. The familiar warmth and strength of his fingers closing around hers settled the last of Elizabeth's nerves. "You're beautiful," James whispered, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "So I've been told," she whispered back with a small smile. The ceremony itself was brief and straightforward, as befitted the frontier setting. Reverend Collins spoke of partnership, respect, and facing life's challenges together, words that resonated deeply with both Elizabeth and James, who had each navigated significant challenges alone until now. When the time came to speak their vows, James's deep voice carried clearly through the church, steady and sure as he promised to cherish, protect, and respect Elizabeth all the days of his life. When it was her turn, Elizabeth spoke with equal conviction, her voice never wavering as she pledged herself to this man, who had already shown her more understanding than she had dared hope for. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Collins concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Sheriff, you may kiss your bride." James's hands gently framed her face, his touch reverent. The kiss he placed on her lips was tender, yet promising, a seal on their vows that spoke of both respect and desire. The church erupted in applause as they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife. The celebration that followed at the town hall embodied the frontier spirit of Silverfall, practical yet generous, simple yet joyful. Long tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes contributed by seemingly every household in town. Fiddle, Music and laughter filled the air as the community celebrated not just a wedding, but the completeness of having their sheriff finally settled with a wife who had already begun to carve her own place in town life. Mrs. Callahan, Dr. Miller greeted her, the title still new to Elizabeth's ears. I understand congratulations are in order beyond your marriage. The school board has officially appointed you as music teacher for 3 afternoons each week. Has it? Elizabeth turned toward James, who stood beside her. Did you know about this? I might have been consulted, he admitted, and she could hear the smile in his voice. They wanted to be sure I wouldn't object to my new wife having professional commitments. And you didn't? Elizabeth asked, though she already knew the answer from their earlier conversations. I told them I'd be a fool to stand between Silverfall's children and the only qualified music teacher within 100 miles. James replied, Besides, I've heard you play. It would be selfish to keep that talent confined to our home. The casual mention of our home sent a pleasant warmth through Elizabeth. After years of boarding houses and rented rooms, the concept of a true home one she would share with a husband who respected her abilities and encouraged her independence seemed almost too fortunate to be real. The afternoon passed in a whirl of congratulations, dancing, James proving to be a surprisingly capable partner, guiding Elizabeth with subtle pressure and quiet directions, and community goodwill. As evening approached, the couple made their way through the crowd toward the exit, ready to begin their married life in the home that would now be theirs together. Just a moment, Sheriff, called Mrs. Weber, hurrying toward them with something in her arms. A wedding gift from all of U.S. ladies of the Silverfall Improvement Society. She pressed a bundle into Elizabeth's hands, something soft and carefully quilted. Elizabeth's sensitive fingers explored the gift, recognizing the intricate pattern of stitches. It's a wedding quilt, Mrs. Weber explained, each square made by a different lady in town. We've been working on it in secret since we heard you. We're coming. It's beautiful, Elizabeth said sincerely, deeply touched by the communal effort this gift represented. Thank you, all of you, for such a thoughtful welcome. The sheriff's been good to this town, Mrs. Weber said simply. We're just glad to see him happy at last. As they finally made their way to James's their house, Elizabeth carried the quilt draped over her arm, a tangible symbol of Silverfall's acceptance. James guided her up the path to the front porch, then paused at the door. Tradition demands I carry you over the threshold, he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. If you have no objection? None whatsoever, Elizabeth replied, equally amused. His arm swept her up with surprising ease, the quilt still clutched in her hands as he carried her across the threshold into their home. Once inside, he set her gently on her feet but kept his hands at her waist. Welcome home, Mrs. Callahan, he said softly. The words sent a thrill through Elizabeth that had nothing to do with the formal ceremony they had just completed, and everything to do with the man whose solid presence radiated warmth beside her. This was real. She was home, she was married, and the desperate gamble that had driven her west had transformed into something far more precious than mere security. I've made some changes since you last visited, James explained as he guided her through the house. Consistent pathways, as you suggested, and tactile markers at crucial junctions. Elizabeth explored with her cane and fingertips, discovering small brass tacks embedded in door frames to mark thresholds, textured wallpaper at hallway intersections, and furniture arranged to create clear pathways throughout the house. Each thoughtful accommodation demonstrated James's commitment to making this truly her home as well as his. The kitchen had been organized with similar care-spice jars with different shaped lids, measuring cups with tactile markings, everything arranged in logical sequences that would allow Elizabeth to cook independently. James, this is... Words failed her momentarily. You've thought of everything. Not everything, I'm sure, he replied. We'll discover what works and what doesn't as we go. But I wanted you to feel at home from the first day. The consideration behind his preparations moved Elizabeth deeply. So many people treated her blindness as an inconvenience to be managed or pitied. James approached it as simply another factor to be accommodated in building their shared life. As evening settled over Silverfall, the new couple shared their first meal in their home, a simple supper. Mrs. Whittaker had prepared in advance and left warming in the oven. They sat at the kitchen table, the ease of their conversation belying the newness of their marriage. James described the sunset visible through the western window, while Elizabeth shared stories of her interactions with the townspeople throughout the day. When they had finished eating, a slight awkwardness descended, the inevitable awareness of what traditionally followed a wedding day. James cleared his throat. "I've prepared the main bedroom for us," he said, his deep voice carrying a note of uncertainty she hadn't heard before. "But the second bedroom is also made up, if you'd prefer. That is, I understand we're still getting to know each other." Elizabeth rose from her chair and moved around the table until she stood before him. With unerring accuracy she reached out to touch his face, her sensitive fingers tracing the contours of his features, the strong jaw, the nose that had clearly been broken at least once, the eye patch that covered his right eye, and the scar that extended beyond it. "James," she said softly, "I came to Silverfall to be your wife in every sense, unless you have reservations." His hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his cheek. "No reservations," he assured her, his voice husky. "Only concern that you might feel rushed or obligated." "I feel neither," Elizabeth replied with simple honesty. "What I feel is fortunate beyond measure to have found a man who sees me so clearly despite my blindness, and grateful that circumstances brought me west to meet him." James stood, his height making her tilt her head back slightly to maintain the conversation. "Then, Mrs. Callahan, shall I show you to our room?" The tenderness with which James introduced Elizabeth to the physical aspects of marriage matched everything she had come to expect from him: considerate, attentive, and deeply respectful of her feelings and comfort. What began with natural nervousness on both sides evolved into a connection that transcended the physical, cementing the emotional bond that had been growing between them since her arrival in Silverfall. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness that was Elizabeth's constant companion, but now seemed to envelop them both in peaceful intimacy, James's fingers traced gentle patterns along her bare arm. "Elizabeth," he said softly, "I want you to know something." "What is it?" she asked, nestled against his side, her head on his shoulder. "When I placed that advertisement, I hoped for companionship, for an end to solitude. I never expected." He paused, searching for words. "I never expected to feel this way. To find someone who understands me without words, who accepts all of me, scars, nightmares, and all." Elizabeth smiled in the darkness. "I understand completely. I came west seeking security, a practical arrangement with a decent man. I never dreamed I would find someone who would make me feel not just accepted, but valued for exactly who I am." His arm tightened around her. "I think perhaps we've both been blind in our own ways," he said thoughtfully, "seeing only our limitations, the things we've lost rather than the possibilities still before us. And now," Elizabeth prompted. "Now I see more clearly with one eye than I ever did with two," James replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Because I'm looking at what matters." The depth of emotion in his voice told Elizabeth more than flowery declarations ever could. This marriage, begun as a practical arrangement between two people society often overlooked, had already blossomed into something neither had dared hope for: a true partnership of equals, a meeting of minds and hearts that transcended physical differences. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural, as if they had been living together for years rather than days. Each morning, James rose early to make coffee before beginning his duties as sheriff. Elizabeth quickly mastered the layout of the house and took over the household management with the efficiency her aunt had instilled in her. 3 afternoons a week, she taught music at the schoolhouse, her students' progress bringing her unexpected fulfillment. Evenings were spent together, sometimes in quiet companionship as James read aloud from books or newspapers, sometimes engaged in lively discussions about town matters or larger issues from the world beyond Silverfall. And nights brought a deepening intimacy that continued to surprise and delight them both. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. James's work occasionally brought danger too close for comfort, such as the night he returned home with a bullet graze along his arm after confronting cattle rustlers on the outskirts of town. Elizabeth's blindness sometimes posed challenges in unexpected situations, like the flash flood that necessitated a rapid evacuation of the schoolhouse with a dozen frightened children in her care. But each challenge faced together only strengthened their bond, confirming what both had begun to suspect from their earliest meetings, that in finding each other, they had discovered something rare and precious. One evening about a month after their wedding, as they sat on the front porch enjoying the cool evening breeze, James suddenly tensed beside her. "What is it?" Elizabeth asked, immediately alert to the change in his posture. "Riders coming," he replied, his sheriff's instincts evident in his tone. 5, maybe 6 horses moving fast toward town. Elizabeth strained her ears and caught the distant thunder of hooves. Trouble? Possibly. James stood, and she heard the familiar sound of him checking his sidearm. Stage wasn't due today, and regular travelers wouldn't be pushing their mounts at that pace. "What will you do?" "Meet them at the edge of town, see what they want." He hesitated. "Elizabeth, if there's trouble—" "I know," she said, rising to stand beside him. "The shotgun is loaded and in the cabinet by the door. I won't hesitate to use it if necessary." The confidence in her voice seemed to reassure him. In their weeks together, Elizabeth had demonstrated that her blindness in no way diminished her capacity for self-reliance. James had taught her to handle firearms safely, impressed by her ability to aim accurately using sound rather than sight. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he promised, pressing a quick kiss to her lips before striding down the porch steps. Elizabeth listened as his footsteps receded, followed by the jingle of his spurs as he mounted his horse and rode toward the sound of the approaching riders. Despite her outward calm, concern tightened her chest. James had been sheriff long enough to earn enemies, and the wildness of the frontier territories meant that violence was never far from possibility. Unable to settle, Elizabeth paced the porch, her acute hearing stretched to its limits. The distant riders had reached the edge of town. She could hear raised voices, though not distinct words. Then a sound that made her blood run cold: gunshots. 3 in rapid succession, followed by shouting and more shots. Elizabeth's hand flew to her throat, her heart pounding. Every instinct urged her to run toward the commotion, toward James, but reason prevailed. She would be of no help rushing blindly into a gunfight. Instead, she moved quickly into the house, retrieving the shotgun from the cabinet with practiced movements. The minutes crawled by, each seeming longer than the last. Elizabeth positioned herself on the porch, shotgun ready, straining to interpret the distant sounds of conflict. More gunshots, the crash of breaking glass, a woman's scream from the direction of the hotel. Then hoofbeats again, moving away from town, followed by a different set approaching the house. A single rider whose pace she recognized immediately, James. "Elizabeth," he called as he dismounted. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she assured him, setting aside the shotgun as he took the porch steps 2 at a time. "What happened?" "Barton gang," James explained, slightly out of breath. "They've been raiding small towns across the territory. Tried to rob the bank, but we were ready for them. Got 2 in custody, 3 escaped." His voice sounded strained, and Elizabeth reached out, her fingers finding wetness on his shirt sleeve. "You're hurt." "Just a scratch," he dismissed, though. She could tell from his breathing that it was more serious than he claimed. "Inside now," she ordered, taking charge with the quiet authority that had already earned her respect throughout Silverfall. "I'll send for Dr. Miller." "No need to. James Callahan, I may be blind, but I'm not a fool," Elizabeth interrupted firmly. "You're bleeding enough to soak through your shirt, and your breathing suggests considerable pain. Inside now." To her relief, he complied without further argument, allowing her to guide him to a kitchen chair. With efficient movements, Elizabeth located clean cloths and a basin of water, then sent their young neighbor to fetch the doctor. As she pressed a cloth against what her exploring fingers told her was a deep gash along James's upper arm, she felt an unexpected calm settle over her. This was marriage, not just the tender moments and shared joys, but facing danger together, providing strength when the other faltered. "I'm sorry," James said quietly. "I didn't mean to worry you." "You're the sheriff," Elizabeth replied simply. "Danger is part of what I accepted when I married you. Besides," she added with a small smile, "I'm made of sterner stuff than you might think." "Oh, I've never doubted that," James chuckled, then winced as the movement jarred his injury. "From the moment you stepped off that train, navigating a strange town with nothing but your cane and your courage, I knew you were remarkable." "As were you," Elizabeth countered, still maintaining pressure on his wound. The one-eyed sheriff, who saw a partner where others might have seen only a burden. Dr. Miller arrived shortly after, treating James's wound with brisk efficiency while commending Elizabeth's first aid efforts. "You've got a steady hand, Mrs. Callahan," he observed. "Ever consider assisting in my practice? I could use someone with your calm under pressure." The offhand comment sparked something in Elizabeth, a realization that her horizons in Silverfall could expand far beyond what she had initially imagined. Not just wife and music teacher, but perhaps something more. That night, as they lay together, in the darkness that equalized them, James's bandaged arm carefully positioned to avoid further injury, Elizabeth voiced the thought that had been forming since the doctor's visit. "I've been thinking," she began, her fingers tracing patterns on James's chest, "about what Dr. Miller said." "About assisting him?" James asked, his voice rumbling beneath her ear. "Yes, not as a formal apprentice, of course, but perhaps I could help with certain aspects of his practice. My sense of touch is highly developed. I can detect subtle changes in temperature, texture, swelling. Useful skills for some medical situations." James was quiet for a moment, considering. "You already teach 3 days a week. Are you sure you want to take on more responsibilities?" "I've spent most of my life having others define my limitations," Elizabeth replied. "Here in Silverfall, I've begun to discover that those limitations were largely invented. Why not explore what else I might be capable of?" James's chest rose and fell in a deep breath. "If anyone had told me 6 months ago that my mail order bride would become not only my partner in every sense, but also a valued teacher and potentially a medical assistant, I wouldn't have believed it possible. Nor would I have believed that a one-eyed sheriff in a frontier town would prove to be the man who finally saw me completely," Elizabeth returned softly. "Yet here we are." "Here we are indeed," James agreed, his arm tightening around her. Mrs. Elizabeth Callahan of Silverfall, Montana Territory, defying expectations at every turn. "With her husband's full support," Elizabeth added, the statement somewhere between question and assertion. "Always," James confirmed without hesitation. "I may wear the badge, but you, my dear, are teaching this town what true courage looks like. How could I do anything but support that?" In the peaceful quiet that followed, Elizabeth reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the desperate young woman who had boarded a train in Boston with nothing but hope and determination, to the confident wife who had found purpose, respect, and love in a place she had never imagined herself belonging. The blind piano tuner and the one-eyed sheriff, each with a perspective uniquely their own, each having learned to navigate a world that often failed to accommodate their differences. Together, they had created something remarkable, a marriage built on mutual respect and genuine understanding, a partnership that recognized strength in supposed weakness, possibility in presumed limitation. As sleep claimed them both, Elizabeth's last conscious thought was one of profound gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought her west to a man whose vision, though physically impaired, had proven clear enough to see the truth that others had missed, that sometimes the most perfect match is found in what others might consider imperfect. The seasons turned in Silverfall, summer heat giving way to crisp autumn days, and eventually to the crystalline chill of Montana winter. As the first anniversary of Elizabeth's arrival approached, the town had changed, and so had the Callahans. What had begun as a practical arrangement had blossomed into a partnership that surprised them both with its depth and resilience. Elizabeth stood at the kitchen stove, stirring a pot of stew while her free hand tracked the steady tick of the specially modified clock on the wall. A wedding gift from the town blacksmith who had crafted tactile markers at each hour position. The familiar sounds of Silverfall's Main Street drifted through the partially open window wagon wheels on packed earth. Children's voices as school let out, the blacksmith's hammer creating a steady rhythm. The door opened, bringing a gust of cold air and the sound of James stomping snow from his boots. "Something smells wonderful," he called, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. "Venison stew," Elizabeth replied, turning toward his voice with a smile. "Mr. Peterson brought the meat by this morning payment for Tommy's piano lessons." She heard James cross the room, then felt his arms encircle her waist from behind, his chin resting atop her head. "How was your day at the clinic?" he asked, dropping a kiss on her hair. "Busy. 3 cases of winter cough, Mrs. Donovan's rheumatism acting up again, and Jamie Weber needed stitches after an unfortunate encounter with his father's woodpile." Elizabeth leaned back against her husband's solid warmth. "Dr. Miller says I have a better touch for stitching than he does steadier hands." "I'm not surprised," James replied, and she could hear the pride in his voice. "You've always had extraordinary hands." Over the past 8 months, Elizabeth's role at the doctor's practice had evolved from occasional assistant to indispensable partner. Her acute sense of touch allowed her to detect subtle abnormalities, swollen glands, fever-heated skin, irregular heartbeats, sometimes before they were visible to the eye. What had begun as a tentative exploration of her capabilities had become a vital service to the community. "And your day?" she asked, returning her attention to the stew. "Any excitement?" "Mostly paperwork," James replied, moving to wash his hands at the basin, "though there is news from Helena. The territorial governor is making an inspection tour next month, and Silverfall is on his itinerary. Is that unusual?" "Very. We're hardly the largest settlement in the territory." James's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "But apparently word has reached Helena about our growth and stability. The governor wants to see for himself." Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. Silverfall had indeed prospered over the past year, with new families arriving regularly, businesses expanding, and a general sense of permanence replacing the transient atmosphere common to many frontier towns. James's fair and consistent enforcement of the law had contributed significantly to this stability. "There's to be a town meeting tomorrow evening to discuss preparations," James continued, retrieving plates from the cabinet. "The governor's visit could mean additional resources, perhaps even consideration for county seat status when the territory eventually achieves statehood." "That would be significant," Elizabeth observed, ladling stew into bowls. "Though I imagine not everyone would welcome more formal governance." James chuckled. "You've learned our frontier politics well, Mrs. Callahan. Yes, there will be opposition, particularly from some of the older miners and ranchers who came west specifically to escape eastern bureaucracy." They settled at the table, falling into the comfortable rhythm of shared meals and open conversation that had become the foundation of their marriage. Elizabeth's perceptive questions about the political implications of the governor's visit demonstrated how thoroughly she had integrated into Silverfall's civic life, while James's detailed descriptions of his day acknowledged her role as his true partner. After dinner, they moved to the parlor where a crackling fire warded off the winter chill. Elizabeth took her customary place at the piano, a wedding gift from the town that had required 4 men to transport from the train station. Her fingers moved across the keys with practiced ease, filling the house with a Chopin nocturne that seemed perfectly suited to the snowy evening. James settled into his armchair, content to listen. These evening concerts had become a cherished ritual, a peaceful interlude before they addressed whatever matters required attention. Tonight, Elizabeth sensed, there was something specific on his mind. His breathing pattern had a subtle tension she had learned to recognize. As the final notes faded, she turned on the bench to face him. "What is it, James?" "There's something you haven't told me." A soft laugh. "I should know better than to try keeping anything from you. Your ears miss nothing." "It's not just my ears," Elizabeth corrected gently. "After a year together, I know when something's weighing on you." There was a moment of silence, then the creak of his chair as he leaned forward. "I received a letter today from my brother in Pennsylvania." Elizabeth's eyebrows rose in surprise. James rarely spoke of his family back east, and had mentioned only in passing that they had drifted apart after his war injury. "What did he want?" "To inform me that my father has died." James's voice carried complex emotions, regret, resignation, a hint of old pain. "The funeral was last month." "Oh, James!" Elizabeth rose and moved to his side, finding his hand with unerring accuracy. "I'm so sorry." He squeezed her fingers. "It's been 15 years since I've seen him." After Gettysburg, after this, she heard the familiar gesture toward his eye patch. "He made it clear I wasn't the son he wanted to present to Pittsburgh society anymore. Damaged goods, he called it." The hurt in his voice tore at Elizabeth's heart. Despite a year of marriage, there were still wounds from their pasts that surfaced unexpectedly, old scars that occasionally reopened. "He was wrong," she said firmly, kneeling beside his chair. "So terribly wrong. I know that now." James's free hand came up to touch her face. "Because of you, Elizabeth. You helped me see that my worth isn't measured by what I've lost, but by what I've built and who I've become." He paused, and she sensed there was more. "What else did the letter say?" "My brother wants me to come east, to help settle the estate. Apparently, my father never formally disinherited me, despite our estrangement. There's property, investments, a considerable inheritance." The implications hung in the air between them, east, back to the society that had rejected them both for their physical differences, back to a world of false politeness masking cruel judgment. "Do you want to go?" Elizabeth asked simply. "Not without you," came his immediate response. "But I'm not sure I want to go at all. I've made my peace with the past. My life, our life is here in Silverfall." Elizabeth considered this. "What would happen to the inheritance if you don't claim it?" "It would eventually go to my brother's children, I suppose. He has 3 sons. And do you need the money?" "For Silverfall, perhaps, or for our future." James was quiet, contemplating. "It could do good here," he finally acknowledged. "The town is growing. We need a proper schoolhouse, a larger clinic. The money could help secure Silverfall's future." Elizabeth nodded, understanding his thinking. James had dedicated himself to this town, to building something meaningful from the wilderness. The inheritance represented not just personal wealth, but potential resources for the community he served. "Then perhaps we should go," she said, "together." "It would mean facing people who once knew me as I was before," James warned. "Society. People with sharp tongues and judgmental eyes. For both of us." Elizabeth smiled, a determined expression that had become familiar to the citizens of Silverfall. James Callahan, if there's one thing I've learned this past year, it's that what others see or fail to see matters far less than I once believed. We've built something remarkable here. You and I, nothing in Pittsburgh or Boston can diminish that. He pulled her into an embrace, his arms solid and secure around her. Have I told you recently that marrying you was the wisest decision of my life? Frequently, Elizabeth laughed. But I never tire of hearing it. The town meeting the following evening was held in the newly completed church hall, the largest gathering space in Silverfall. Nearly every adult resident attended, a testament to the significance of the governor's impending visit. Elizabeth sat beside James at the front, her position as the sheriff's wife now complemented by her own standing as the town's piano teacher and medical assistant. Mayor Weber, who doubled as the general store proprietor, called the meeting to order with a rap of his gavel. As you've all heard, Governor Stevens will be visiting Silverfall next month. This is an opportunity to showcase our town's progress and stability. The territorial legislature will be making decisions about resource allocation and infrastructure development. We want Silverfall to be remembered favorably. A rumble of conversation followed this announcement. Elizabeth listened carefully to the undercurrents, mostly positive, with some predictable grumbling from the old-timers. What's the governor want from us? Called Silas Henderson, an elderly miner who had been among the first to stake claims in the area. More taxes? More rules? What he wants, James responded, rising to address the gathering, is to see a thriving community worthy of territorial investment. Roads, telegraph lines, postal service, perhaps eventually a rail spur. These things require government attention and funding. We've done fine without government interference for years, another voice objected. Have we? James countered. How many of you enjoy receiving mail more than once a month? How many would appreciate a doctor having reliable access to medical supplies? How many miners would benefit from better transportation for their silver? The meeting proceeded with vigorous debate, the frontier spirit of independence clashing with practical needs for development. Elizabeth listened with interest, occasionally offering observations when the discussion turned to educational or medical considerations. Her quiet, articulate contributions earned respectful attention, a far cry from her early days in Silverfall when some had questioned what a blind woman could possibly offer the community. As the meeting concluded with committees formed to address various aspects of the governor's visit, Dr. Miller approached the Callahans. Elizabeth, I've been meaning to discuss something with you and the sheriff. What is it, doctor? She asked, hearing the unusual formality in his tone. I've received an offer from a hospital in Denver, he explained. They need an experienced frontier physician to head their new training program for doctors, planning to practice in rural areas. You're leaving Silverfall? James asked, surprise evident in his voice. I'm considering it, Dr. Miller admitted. It's an exceptional opportunity, but I'm concerned about leaving the town without medical care. Elizabeth felt the weight of his unspoken question. You're wondering if I could maintain the clinic in your absence. With appropriate support, yes, he confirmed. You've learned more in the past 8 months than many formal apprentices manage in years. Your diagnostic skills are remarkable, and the patients trust you. But I'm not a qualified doctor, Elizabeth pointed out. I have no formal training or certification. True, Dr. Miller acknowledged. But frontier medicine has always required practical skills more than paper credentials. I could arrange for a young doctor from Denver to visit quarterly for consultation on complex cases. For day-to-day care, you're already more capable than most practitioners I've encountered in similar towns. The proposal hung in the air, another unexpected turning point in a life that had already taken so many surprising directions. Elizabeth felt James's hand come to rest supportively at the small of her back. What are you thinking? James asked as they climbed the steps to their porch. That life has a strange way of opening doors I never knew existed, Elizabeth replied honestly. A year ago, I was a piano tuner struggling to maintain independence. In Boston, now I'm being asked to take responsibility for an entire town's medical care. James unlocked their front door. Does that frighten you? Terrify might be a better word, Elizabeth admitted with a small laugh. And yet, there's a certain logic to it. My sense of touch allows me to detect things others might miss. I've learned to work systematically to compensate for what I can't see with other observations. In some ways, my blindness has prepared me for this role. Inside, as they shed their winter wraps, James pulled her into an embrace. Whatever you decide, I'll support you completely. You know that, don't you? I do, Elizabeth said, resting her head against his chest, drawing strength from his steady heartbeat. That certainty is what gives me courage to even consider possibilities that once would have seemed impossible. The following weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Preparations for the governor's visit consumed much of the town's energy, while Elizabeth divided her time between teaching, assisting at the clinic, and deep conversations with Dr. Miller about what assuming greater medical responsibilities would entail. Meanwhile, James made arrangements for their journey east after the governor's visit. Letters were exchanged with his brother, accommodations secured, and transportation booked. Though neither spoke of it directly, both harbored apprehensions about returning to the society that had once defined them by their disabilities rather than their capabilities. The governor's visit itself proved to be a turning point for Silverfall. Governor Stevens, a practical man with a soldier's appreciation for efficiency and order, was visibly impressed by the town's development. The neat streets, thriving businesses, and general air of prosperity spoke to James's effective leadership as sheriff and the community's collaborative spirit. At a formal dinner held in the governor's honor, Elizabeth found herself seated beside the distinguished visitor, a position that once would have mortified her with self-consciousness about her blindness. Now she engaged him in confident conversation about the town's educational needs and medical challenges. Mrs. Callahan, I must say I'm impressed, the governor remarked as dessert was served. When I was informed that Silverfall's sheriff had married a blind woman from Boston, I confess I had certain preconceptions. As most people do, Governor, Elizabeth replied with the straightforward dignity that had become her hallmark. I've found that the best response is simply to demonstrate what is possible rather than argue about what others believe impossible. A philosophy that has served you well, evidently, he observed. I understand from Dr. Miller that you've become something of a medical authority in town. I assist where I can, Elizabeth said modestly. The human body communicates through touch and sound as well as sight. Sometimes, not being distracted by visual appearances allows me to perceive subtler signs. The governor made a thoughtful sound, an interesting perspective. Have you considered how your approach might benefit medical training more broadly? The question caught Elizabeth by surprise. I'm not sure I understand, Governor. The territory is establishing a medical training program in Helena, he explained. Frontier medicine requires unconventional thinking and adaptability. Your methods might offer valuable insights for practitioners heading to remote locations where traditional medical resources are limited. The suggestion that her adaptations might have value beyond her personal circumstances, that the very limitations others saw as defining her, might actually offer unique contributions, struck Elizabeth profoundly. It echoed a theme that had emerged repeatedly throughout her time in Silverfall. That difference, when embraced rather than merely accommodated, could become strength. That night, as she and James prepared for bed, Elizabeth shared the governor's remarks. He suggested I might have something to teach other medical practitioners, James. Me teaching doctors. Why does that surprise you? James asked, the bed frame creaking slightly as he sat beside her. You've already transformed how Dr. Miller approaches certain cases. Your ability to detect subtle variations in pulse, temperature, and tissue Consistency has proven invaluable. But to formalize that, to suggest it has broader application, Elizabeth shook her head in wonder. It never occurred to me that the adaptations I've developed out of necessity might actually advance medical practice in some small way. James took her hands in his. Elizabeth, from the moment you stepped off that train, you've been expanding. People's understanding of what's possible, mine included. Why should medicine be any different? As spring brought new life to the Montana landscape, the Callahans prepared for their journey east. Dr. Miller had decided to delay his departure for Denver until their return, ensuring Silverfall wouldn't be without medical care. The governor's office had arranged for Elizabeth to observe and consult at the Territorial Medical Training Facility in Helena on their way back from Pittsburgh, an opportunity that both excited and intimidated her. The evening before their departure, a surprise gathering was held at the town hall, a celebration not of any particular occasion, but simply of the community Silverfall had become. As Elizabeth moved through the crowded room, accepting good wishes and promises to mind things while you're away, she marveled at how completely this place had become home. Mrs. Weber pressed a package into her hands. "For your journey," she explained. "Biscuits and preserves. I remember how dreadful train food can be. And this," added Mr. Peterson, "is from the school children. They've each written or drawn something for you to remember them by." The thoughtfulness of these gestures brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. A year and a half ago, she had arrived in Silverfall a stranger, desperate for security and acceptance. Now she departed as a beloved community member whose absence, however temporary, would be genuinely felt. Later, as James described the stars visible above their porch, Elizabeth reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "I never imagined any of this," she said softly. "When I answered your advertisement, I hoped merely for basic security and perhaps companionable respect. I never dreamed of partnership, purpose, community, of feeling so completely seen." James's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Nor did I imagine that a mail-order bride from Boston would transform not just my life, but an entire town's understanding of capability and contribution." "We've been fortunate beyond measure," Elizabeth acknowledged. "Not just fortunate," James corrected gently, "courageous. It took courage for you to travel across the country to marry a stranger. It took courage for me to open myself to connection after years of solitude. And it takes courage every day to define ourselves by our possibilities rather than our limitations." Elizabeth smiled, leaning into his solid warmth. "The one-eyed sheriff and his blind bride," she mused. "Who would have thought we'd prove to be a perfect match? Perhaps we're perfect, not despite our differences, but because of them," James suggested. "Because we've had to learn to see beyond the obvious, to value what truly matters." As they stood together under the vast Montana sky, Elizabeth felt a profound sense of rightness. The desperate gamble that had led her west had yielded rewards beyond imagination: love, purpose, respect, and the discovery that sometimes what the world perceives as broken is merely a different kind of wholeness. Their journey east would bring challenges, certainly. Society's judgments hadn't softened in their absence. But they would face those challenges together, strengthened by the knowledge that they had built something remarkable in Silverfall, a life defined not by what they lacked, but by what they had created together. "Whatever comes next," Elizabeth said softly, "I'm grateful for this unexpected life we found." "As am I," James replied, his voice carrying the depth of emotion that had grown between them. "Though perhaps it's not so unexpected after all. Perhaps we were always meant to find each other, the two of us who see the world differently than most, who understand that true vision comes from the heart rather than the eyes." In that moment, standing on the threshold of their home with the future stretching before them, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world, not in spite of her blindness, but with it as an integral part of who she was and what she could offer. And in James Callahan, she had found not just a husband, but a partner who truly saw her, completely and without reservation. Together, they had rewritten the story society had tried to impose upon them, creating instead a narrative of their own, making one where supposed flaws became unique strengths, where differences became complementary gifts, and where the capacity to see beyond physical sight proved to be the most perfect vision of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.